Avast, me hearties! Shiver me timbers! Batten down the hatches! Raise the mainsail! Secure the jib! We're in for a bumpy ride as we head out to sea to conclude Laurie Alexander's views on the election. Maybe we'll find some buried treasure, you think? What? You thought I'd never get to this video? Is water wet? Hello and welcome. I hope you're not too washed out with Laurie to hear her one last time. Today, she talks about
the freedom of religion, which we absolutely believe.
While I am spending a lot of time on this 11.5-minute video, she does discuss three very important topics, and thus I wanted to cover them all. Next time we'll do demons. That should be fun. There may be a week or two gap before the next video, as I'm going to be out of town for a couple of weeks. Hopefully, if the pandemic doesn't cancel our trip. Smooth sailing? Speaking of cancel, is my aim to cancel religion? Am I against the freedom of religion? Am I angry with God, as some accuse? Absolutely not. I'm fine with people believing whatever they want to believe. But that won't change me wanting to challenge beliefs that I don't agree with. As a Christian, I challenge the beliefs of non-believers on a regular basis. It's part of what led me away from the faith. It's what brought me to the realization that all of Christianity stands or falls with the Bible. When I would try to share my faith with someone that didn't believe in the Bible, I searched for extra-biblical support for Christianity. Whenever I found any, it was always easily discredited, and thus I realized that the Bible really was all there was to support Christianity. And I'm only 2 minutes into this video, and already I'm headed out to sea. Let's get back to Laurie.
And so in our Constitution guarantees, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris don't believe in those things.
But she makes a very bold claim here, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris don't believe in freedom of religion. You can see why she thinks this way when her source, Father Meeks, says,
"There are powerful forces in government at every level, as well as in the mainstream media and in the Silicon Valley technocracy, that are working aggressively to silence the church through legislation, lies, intimidation, and censorship."
But Laurie goes quite a bit further in claiming that Biden and Harris don't support the Constitution on this. I didn't edit anything out here. Here is her full support for her claim that Biden and Harris don't believe in freedom of religion.
And then they want to, you could see during the lockdown that they still don't want churches to meet. And I really admire churches like John MacArthur that are packed full, and I admire those people who don't fear the virus.
You can see during the lockdown they don't want churches to meet. No evidence about Biden and Harris having anything against religion. No evidence that Biden and Harris said anything about churches meeting during the pandemic. Just this vague, they don't want churches to meet. Biden and Harris didn't make any of the laws about lockdowns. Biden and Harris never said anything about churches meeting. So who is this they? Mermaids? Lockdown orders did include churches, but they weren't aimed at churches. Hair salons and gyms were closed too. Does that make Biden and Harris anti-hair and anti-exercise? Biden has said that his plan for dealing with the pandemic includes a national mask requirement. He has said nothing about a national lockdown. So Laurie makes this huge claim that Biden doesn't believe in freedom of religion and doesn't support the Constitution, and her evidence for this claim is city mayors and state governors have restricted church meetings with their pandemic responses. This would be on par with a prosecutor going into court claiming that the defendant murdered someone with a knife, and his proof is that someone, not the defendant, in his state bought a knife that week. I know, that made no sense. Nor does Laurie's claim. She has no statements from Biden and Harris about how either feels about churches being restricted during lockdowns. No statement from either on the constitutionality of such laws. No statement that either support or don't support such restrictions. Yet she concludes that they don't support freedom of religion. If your logic takes you from there were lockdowns to Biden and Harris oppose freedom of religion because there were lockdowns, I think it's time for you to find something else to do with your time, as you clearly have no clue what you're talking about. Your argument doesn't hold water.
They fear not gathering together. They fear not obeying God more than a virus that kills 5% or 4% of people over 70 years old.
Here, we get to the problem with your theology. I understand that you think you have a soul, and that your soul lives on after you die, and if you live your life according to God's plan, your soul will live in eternal reward with your God. I used to think that way too. It does feel like it's more important to focus on the eternal rather than the earthly, as the earth will eventually pass away. But this is the only life that you know you have. And while you say that you know you are going to heaven, you really don't. It's just faith. And while I understand that faith is everything to you, it's still something you have no reason to believe except that you have faith. In other words, you believe it because you believe it. It's why I chose the slogan, "Live your life." It's the only one you have, so don't waste it chasing rainbows. Some people claim to have been dead and to have seen heaven. Yet in near-death experiences, people experience the afterlife in accordance with the faith that they had before the experience. Christians see Jesus. Muslims see Muhammad. But Muslims don't report seeing Jesus. Atheists report seeing the God of the culture that they grew up in. Many find such stories compelling and life-changing. Dr. Raymond Moody has done extensive research into this area, interviewing people who have had NDEs, near-death experiences, and believes this to be evidence of an afterlife. He includes many stories from people who weren't dying, but were under significant stress, or believed that they were dying, and had similar experiences. I myself was swayed by some of these stories at one time, but even Dr. Moody admits that there is no proof that these experiences are real. Because of the nature of when they occur, it's nearly impossible to study the phenomena directly. This article in Scientific American says that they have found the experiences to be similar to the effects of the drug ketamine or other similar drugs. Their hypothesis is the dying process or high stress events may cause the brain to naturally produce such a chemical. Testing this hypothesis would cause too much harm to the test subjects to allow such testing. For now, that knowledge still lies in the murky depths. Which puts us back at this is the only life we know that we have. So we should make the most of it. We should all live our lives, as Qui-Gon Jinn said.
Keep your concentration here and now where it belongs.
But Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future.
But not at the expense of the moment.
Wanting to gather during a pandemic, when we know such gatherings spread disease causing illness, suffering, and death, is keeping your mind on the future at the expense of the present. Lori, hold your beliefs, but not at the expense of causing suffering and death to other people. Don't be a wet blanket.
So I appreciate Joe MacArthur speaking out against the evils of the left, the Democratic Party.
When I heard Lori here, I had to go look this up, and here is what I found. Lori is actually right here. MacArthur called the Democratic Party the anti-God party. This article is from 2012, so it's old news. But just like that, all the respect that I used to have for John MacArthur has now flushed down the toilet. Yet he still has a large following in Los Angeles. Interestingly, John Piper announced that he was not voting because he couldn't support either candidate. He took a lot of flack for that stance, especially from single-issue voters that follow him that felt all Trump's lies, cheating, violence, and hatred can be forgiven because he's anti-abortion. The only thing that matters to them. Is a drop of compassion too much to ask?
And I just found out recently that the reason pastors can speak about politics these days, which is really not even about politics anymore, it's about immorality, is because President Trump overturned something that said that they couldn't.
She got a few things confused here. Not surprising. She has no source except she heard this somewhere. She's referring to a tax law that says 501c3 charities can't take a political stance and retain their tax-exempt status. It's called the Johnson Amendment. If a group wants to be a nonprofit political group, they can, but not as a 501c3. And not all 501c3s are churches. Churches retain huge tax benefits by being 501c3 organizations. If a church wants to take a political stance and not violate this law, they have to reorganize under a different subcategory. James Dobson and Focus on the Family ran into problems with their political stances and this tax law. They decided to be a political group and they reorganized, so they stayed within the law. What Lori is referring to is this, and you can see why people like Lori see this order in the way that they do, because, as the article says, Trump told supporters, "We will not allow people of faith to be targeted, bullied, or silenced anymore." This was to fulfill a campaign promise he made in 2016. Trump told an audience at a Virginia rally, "I think it's very unfair, and one of the things I will do very early in my administration is to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, so that our great pastors and ministers, rabbis and everybody, and priests and everybody can go and tell and can participate in the process." I know it's a little convoluted. It's Trump. But what the order actually does is it directs the Secretary of the Treasury to exercise discretion to avoid taking any adverse action against an individual, house of worship, or a religious organization that speaks about moral or political issues from a religious perspective, including the revocation of 501c3 status. So what is the legal effect of this order? According to J.D. Supra, does this executive order free religious 501c3 charitable organizations to engage in partisan political activity without fear of tax-exempt status revocation? Perhaps not. While the executive order may promote more relaxed enforcement, the restrictions on partisan political activity still exist in the statute, and legislative action would be required to change the law. In addition, this executive order may face legal challenges in court. The executive order also raises the question whether churches should be treated differently from non-religious 501c3 entities. Until and unless the statute is changed, 501c3 organizations would do well to refrain from participating in partisan political activity. In other words, this order that Lori is happy that has freed her pastor to speak his mind on politics actually didn't do anything except direct the Secretary of Treasury not to enforce existing law. Our law and order president wants the Secretary of Treasury to just ignore the law when it suits his purposes of sidling up to his supporters.
So that's why you see some bold pastors preaching against the Democratic Party and what they believe, the murdering of babies, marriage to anybody, and locking down churches.
Man overboard? You see just how confused Lori is. Churches were never prevented from speaking out against any issue they wanted to. It's why pastors like Steve Anderson have been able to spew their hate speech from within their churches. Their tax status was never endangered by doing so. They can't say those kinds of things in public, though, as it's likely to incite violence, since they actively call for violence in their message. The only thing that's easier to do under the Trump order is take a stance on a political party or a candidate. Lori is equating speaking out against Democrats to speaking out against social issues. It's not the same. She seems to think the Democrat beliefs are the root of the issue. It's true that Democrats tend to champion these causes, but the causes existed before the Democrats chose to support them. Democrats aren't the source of the spring. If you can't experience freedom to practice your religion without vilifying Democrats, you have a serious problem with your theology. There were no Democrats in Jesus' day, yet Christians seemed able to practice their religion just fine without the need to speak out against Democrats. As a side note, the Catholic Church seems to agree with me on this point, at least partially. I found this as I was researching this point. The Catholic Diocese of La Crosse is denouncing the words of a La Crosse priest who claims that Democrats are godless and imposters who will go to hell if they don't repent. But then again, Lori's source is the sermon of Father Meeks, who says,
It's time for faithful Catholics to stand up and say, enough is enough. To all office holders and politicians who claim to be devout Catholics while publicly and obstinately contradicting the Church and subverting her teachings.
He never directly says don't vote for Biden or Biden isn't a real Catholic, but that is clearly what he means. My take from the extent of the division in the Catholic Church on politics is that Catholics are people. Just like every other demographic, not all members of the demographic think the same on any particular issue. The only question is how much variance is okay before you are no longer a member of the demographic. That's a question only the Catholic Church can answer, and the variety of answers that we see show that the boundary isn't hard and fast. With the decline of the Church, it's becoming more blurred. Lori's next statement is puzzling.
And pulling Jews out of synagogues and everything, so.
I'm not sure what she's referring to. It could be this. It is a story about how Jews are being pulled out of synagogues, but it's from 2005 and it's in Israel. It has nothing to do with American politics. More likely she means this. In one particularly ugly incident, black rioters shouted at Jewish men who said they came out to show solidarity with Black Lives Matter. In the video, several black men taunt the Jews. "Y'all know that we, the real Jews, right?" one black man says, repeating the black Hebrew Israelite narrative. Not only are some black people descended from Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel, which is plausible, but that only black people have a rightful claim to true Judaism. But the story says the Jewish men came out to support Black Lives Matter, now that they were pulled out of synagogues. I think Lori has a couple of stories confused here. I could find no other stories about Jews being pulled from synagogues. If someone in the audience knows about an incident that could be what she's referring to, please tell me about it in the comments. On the port side, Trump obviously got through to his supporters even before the election that if Biden wins, it can only be because he cheated. She posted this before the election.
I trust that whoever wins is supposed to win, even if the Democrats cheat to win. God's allowing that to happen.
If God's allowing it, and it's part of his plan, then I guess it's for the best. Because of course everything that happens does so because God wanted it, and he wants what's best. So it's the best of all possible worlds that we live in. Candide lives! Back to the starboard.
I'll be very disappointed. I'll probably cry. I remember sobbing when President Clinton won his first term because I knew that he was not a decent moral man.
And Trump is a decent moral man? She has an interesting concept of moral man, doesn't she?
And I will be very sad because I know Kamala Harris, the most leftist person in the Congress, will be our president.
I think Lori's been watching too much Fox News if she thinks Harris is more liberal than Bernie, Ocasio-Cortez, Warren, or Schumer. This opinion article ranked the top 29 most liberal senators. Harris didn't even make the list. That list was made in the year that she was elected to the Senate, so there might not have been enough data for her to be included. But I also found no one, except Fox News, that puts Harris at the most liberal, and then not until after she was selected as Biden's running mate. Also interesting to note that she thinks Harris will run the country and not Biden. I've heard this from other conservatives too. Hopefully reality will sink in at some point. Or am I indulging in wishful thinking? Back to our original heading, religious liberty in the church.
And I don't see America getting better. I see the churches weak. They're not even strong enough to teach against women speaking and teaching in the churches. And when you compromise on that, you're going to compromise on everything eventually.
And yet here you are, Lori, speaking and teaching. Granted, not in the church, but if you are going to compromise on the location, you're going to compromise on everything eventually. And now I need to apologize. In the last video, I said that Lori would claim victim status. I thought I heard that in the video with regard to her religious views. But when I went back to find it to respond, it wasn't there. Lori does not claim to be a victim of religious persecution, as I had thought. My apologies. Hopefully now it's all water under the bridge. Lori's moral compass points her to Trump for giving her religious liberty. But did Trump give her any actual religious liberty that she didn't already have? I do realize that some Christians think he did, and they are bolder in proclaiming their views as a result, as Lori says. But the legal difference is non-existent. It's rather symbolic of the faith. It sounds good. It spurs you to do good things, sometimes, believe certain things. But when you look at the basis for the entire faith, God, what do you find? Nothing. It all evaporates. Reality can be touched, experienced, lived, and not just in your mind. It's why we can answer the question, is water wet? Yep, it's wet. Ah, I found some woody. It says, live your life.